Question. Can I ask you, what is the point of joining a spiritual movement? Seems purposeless. Well, if it seems purposeless to you, don't join a spiritual movement. I mean, nobody says you have to. But I can tell you why myself and many people I've met over the years joined spiritual movements. And one of the main reasons is that those of us who have grown up in the West have grown up in an environment where there was no talk about the spiritual side of life. There was no talk about a spiritual path that you could follow to a higher state of consciousness. There was no even talk about you could reach a higher state of consciousness than what's considered normal. Many of us were sort of between a rock and a hard spot, and the rock was Christianity and the hard spot was scientific materialism. That Christianity tells us we are sinners and materialism tells us we are evolved apes and nothing spiritual. So we feel like outsiders, we have questions that can't be answered. We can't really talk to people freely about these questions we have. And so at a certain point, we suddenly find a spiritual movement, a spiritual teaching, a spiritual guru. And now we realize, oh, but I'm not the only one who had all these questions. Other people have had them too. I just never met anybody before. But here's the spiritual movement, and there are hundreds of people here that have the same questions and they are open to talking about. I can talk about my spiritual beliefs and questions. I can talk freely. And that's one of the main reasons that people join a spiritual movement, because all of a sudden you have an environment where it's safe to be spiritual. Now some movements will eventually have limitations on what you can talk about, because you can only talk about their teaching and what the guru said. And all of a sudden people find that, oh, I still have questions that I can't talk about in this movement. So maybe they move on to another movement, or maybe they get disillusioned with spiritual movements, whatever. But this is one of the main reasons. Another reason is, of course, that the teaching, the movement offers you something. I mean, when I found my first spiritual movement, it was Transcendental Meditation. And I was 18 years old, and I had all these questions I'd been asking myself during my childhood. And the TM movement at the time had some courses you could take that gave you spiritual teachings in a concentrated form. And they were very helpful to me. I mean, today I look back at them and see they had certain limitations, but at the time it was what I needed. They were very helpful. For example, they had a lot of videos about quantum physics. At the time I found TM, which was in the late 70s, Deepak Chopra, who is now famous in his own right, he was young and he was part of the TM movement. He gave a lot of lectures about quantum physics and spirituality, and they were very helpful to me. They were very inspiring to me, because I'd always been wondering about why is there this warfare between science and religion. So anyway, what I'm saying is that many spiritual movements, they have teachings they offer that actually help people expand their understanding of the spiritual side of life. And then many spiritual movements also have a practice. Transcendental Meditation, it was obviously meditation. In the Summit Lighthouse, it was, which was an Ascended Master organization I found after Transcendental Meditation, it was decreeing, invoking spiritual light. And many spiritual movements, they will practice their practice in group settings, which many people experience as being more powerful than doing it alone. Obviously you can do it alone and it has a certain effect. But many people experience by being together, either by meditating in a group or by, especially in the Summit Lighthouse, we invoke these spiritual light in a group. It was a much more powerful experience, especially when you're new, because you're sort of carried on with the momentum of the spiritual movement. Another reason or point for joining a spiritual movement is that many spiritual movements have a teacher or guru, often a person who started the movement. And if it's a genuine guru who has a lot of experience on the spiritual path, then obviously you can benefit from being around such a guru, interacting with the guru if that's possible. It's usually only possible in smaller spiritual movements. As movements get bigger, the guru can't interact with everybody. There just isn't time, and so usually there's a certain distance that's created between the ordinary members and the guru. But if it's a smaller movement and you can interact with that guru, then you can benefit from it. I was a member of an organization, as I've said, called the Summit Lighthouse, and the leader, Elizabeth Care Prophet, definitely had a higher state of consciousness than I did. And I had a couple of interactions with her that really I benefited from. One of them especially, I would say, was pivotal on my spiritual path. So you can definitely benefit from that. The trouble is, it's not always so easy to find an organization with a guru that you can interact with. What you see in many spiritual movements out there is that the guru is no longer in physical embodiment. So you have what I call the dead guru syndrome, where now there isn't the guru, but the members, especially the long-term members, have idolized the guru and put him or her up on a pedestal as being very, very special. And the guru isn't there to counteract it anymore, so you can build this sort of idolatry around the guru, which isn't necessarily beneficial. But if it is a genuine guru, you can benefit from it. But even if there isn't the guru, you can still meet people who have been on the spiritual path longer than you have. And when you're new, it can be very valuable for you to interact with and talk with people who have more experience, who have tried different things. Not saying it isn't a double-edged sword, because these people can sometimes be set in their ways. They can have a specific way of looking at the spiritual path that isn't necessarily the way you want to look at it. But still, it can be valuable to have the perspective of other people and benefit from their experiences. I remember when I was new, I met people who had been in many different spiritual teachings, many different spiritual movements, and therefore had a much broader perspective on it than I did. And that was definitely beneficial to talk to people that way. Another point that is attractive for many people is that I would say generally, as spiritual people, we have a sense that there's something wrong with the world. There's something missing in the world. And we can often have an intuitive sense that we're here to do something about it. We're here to help the world improve. And many spiritual movements have teachings that talk about this, that the movement has a purpose, and it is to somehow improve conditions in the world. In Transcendental Meditation, it was said that by meditating, we are helping to raise the collective consciousness and overcome crime and eventually war and this and that. In the Summit Lighthouse, we were giving these decrees, invoking light from the Ascended Masters, and it was also done to improve conditions in the world. So you can always debate, you can always be skeptical and say, is this real or not? But I'm just talking about what is the point that makes people join a spiritual movement, and I'm saying that there are people who have this need to feel that they're doing something valuable for the world, and a spiritual movement can fulfill that need by giving you the sense that you are doing something. And I honestly believe that there are many spiritual movements that are making a positive contribution to the raising of the collective consciousness in various ways. So I clearly see that there are some movements that have an overinflated sense of self-importance in this regard. They think that they alone are saving the world. And I don't think that's realistic, but I do think that the only way the world is going to progress is by raising a collective consciousness, and this means that, and this happens when people individually raise their consciousness, and when they make a contribution to, for example, consuming fear-based energy and others spreading peaceful energies. And so a spiritual movement can have, and I believe many spiritual movements have had a positive impact on the world. And there are many people that have a need for that. I talk about that, and I have a playlist called Avatar Psychology, where I say that there are certain people who we came to Earth specifically to help improve conditions on this planet. We came from a natural planet to this very unnatural planet. And we have a need to feel that we're doing something valuable, and a spiritual movement can fulfill that need. Then there is in some cases, some movements, they will have a retreat setting somehow, It can be something they rented, it can be they own a piece of property, that's their main headquarters, and they offer that people can come and live there and work there. And there are people who have this dream of being part of a community. And if they're spiritual people and they awaken to the spiritual side of life, they have a dream of being part of a spiritual community. So this is another thing that a spiritual movement can fulfill for people who have that desire. You can feel you're part of a spiritual community. And this can cause people to leave their home country, travel to another continent or another part of the world to be part of a spiritual community. And for many people, it's a valuable experience. For some, it's only a time. After a time, they feel like they have to go back out into normal society. Other people stay there for a long time. I mean, I've also seen people who get stuck in a spiritual community because it's like they feel like they can't deal with ordinary life compared to the spiritual community. You see the same, of course, in monks and nuns in the Catholic tradition who, after being in a monastery for a while, they couldn't even conceive of living a normal life out there because they can't deal with the world. So it can become an escape. I'm not saying it's hunky-dory. I'm just saying these are some of the reasons. I mean, the question was, what is the point of joining a spiritual movement? So I'm telling you what the point is for some people. Another reason is that spiritual movements often give people a sense of belonging. Because as I said, we grow up in a non-spiritual environment. We feel like outsiders. We feel like we don't really belong there. And many spiritual movements have this culture that the reason for that was that you were already spiritually mature from past lifetimes. You had reached a certain level of spiritual maturity where you couldn't fit into the normal culture out there. You can't just live your life, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Attitude, you needed some purpose in life. And this is the purpose, to be on the spiritual path, to be part of this spiritual community. So people feel they belong. Now, closely related to the sense of belonging is the question of what do you belong to? And many spiritual movements have this culture that you belong to this very, very special group of people. Because you are so mature, that's why you could recognize this movement, that's why you are willing to remove yourself from your normal life and come here and be part of this community. This makes you very special. So I'm not saying this is healthy. This can actually slow down your spiritual growth or even take it into a blind alley. But many spiritual movements, this is what people want. They want this sense that they are special because they belong to this movement that has the highest guru, the highest spiritual teaching, the highest form of organization, and therefore they are very special. As I said, I first found Transcendental Meditation. It was back in 1976, and they had this sense. We are so special because we are doing Transcendental Meditation. I'm pretty sure they still have it. They still have a movement. They have a headquarters in the United States. Where's it at? Iowa, I think. Or is it? I think it's Iowa. But anyway, they probably still have that sense. Then my next spiritual movement was the Summit Lighthouse. Felt very, very special. I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine they still feel very special. And then I lived, after I moved from the Summit, I actually lived at the Summit Lighthouse headquarters for 10 years in Montana. Then I moved to Utah, where it's dominated by the Mormons. And the Mormons, which is not really considered a New Age or spiritual movement, but they have the exact same attitude. We are so special because we are Mormons. They don't believe in reincarnation, but they have other reasons for it. So I'm just saying this is one of the fringe benefits of spiritual movement is you can come to feel you're very, very special. And some people need that for a time. I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with it. If you're grown up in this society where you felt like an outsider, you may need this sense for a time, but it should become a phase where you grow out of it. You come to a point where you realize, do I really need this anymore? And therefore you reevaluate, where do I need to go next on my spiritual path? So, so this is one thing. What's the point? So I think those are sort of the main points I can think of. For some people, joining a spiritual movement, especially if it offers them that they can live and work there, or if it has a larger following, it can become almost like a crutch. It's a convenient lifestyle. In the Summit Lighthouse, at one point, they had 600 people on staff, and they didn't get any salary. They got room and board, but they had a very secure lifestyle. Everything was laid out for them, what they had to do and how they had to live. It was kind of like a monastery, a Catholic monastery, in a way, in the sense that everything was organized. And so some people, they liked that lifestyle. There were other people who were in the movement because they had some kind of business, and there were always people looking to make easy money, and so they were using it as a way to make a living. Multi-level marketing schemes galore, and you saw the same thing in Utah, for example, where the Mormons, every multi-level marketing known to man was at some point had gone through the Mormon church, as they did in the Summit Lighthouse and other spiritual movements. So there can be other points like that are not really spiritual. I mean, I have seen people who joined the spiritual movement as a way to promote their multi-level marketing business, and they were not interested in the spiritual teachings whatsoever. But that's not really the point of joining a spiritual movement. It might be the reason. So any other reasons, any other points? Well, I guess you could say also that many spiritual movements, they offer you a sense that of security, that you're going to reach the goal. Every spiritual movement defines a certain goal. In the TM, it was cosmic consciousness. In the Summit Lighthouse, it was the ascension. In the Mormons, it was obviously salvation. And so most spiritual movements, they give you this sense that if you are a member in good standing, if you follow all the rules and regulations that the movement prescribes, you're going to make it to that goal. And so again, this gives people this sense of security. This is, of course, because they're not mature enough to take responsibility for themselves and their own growth. But I'm just saying, there are people who need that. And again, if it's a phase, it's okay to have it for a while, but you should eventually grow out of it. I guess you could have, if you really step back from the whole scenario, you could have some movements that give you other benefits. For example, the Osho movement, the Rajneesh movement. I don't know what they do today, but at least in his younger days, there was free sex. The community he had in Pune, India, it was pretty much free sex. You could have sex with anybody. You should have sex because having as much sex as possible was seen as a way to further your spiritual growth. So this obviously catered, especially back in the 60s, 70s, to a lot of people who had come out of the very restrictive sexual culture of the 50s, had embraced the liberation of the 60s, so-called liberation of the 60s. And here was a spiritual movement that not only allowed it, but encouraged it and said it was a way to promote your spiritual growth. So a spiritual movement can therefore give you an excuse for doing what you want to do and even call it spiritual and feel that this is spiritual. So another point, if you think, I don't know how long I should go on with this, but another point I saw that I've seen myself is that if you have a spiritual movement that reaches a certain size, it creates certain positions. You can be working for the movement, but it gives you a certain position of power because now you are one of the up and up people in the movement, and you have a say not only in how the movement functions, but you have a say over other people. In the Summit Lighthouse, for example, they had this departments, various departments, and each department had a department head. And I'm not saying it was the case for all of them, but some of them saw themselves as they were like the spiritual hierarch for the people who worked in their department, and they were under them and they should obey them, because if they didn't, it was their ego acting out and they were actually rebelling against the ascended masters and this and that. So in other words, it gave some people a sense of power over other people. I'm not saying I agree with this, I approve of it, but I'm just saying it's another benefit, so to speak, fringe benefit that some people got out of being in the spiritual movement. And you saw some people, even in TM also, who came in the early days of the movement. And they were willing to work for the movement to help the movement grow, so they worked their way up in the ranks. And now they had a leadership position. But they got that leadership position simply from having been there so long, not because they necessarily had any ability as leaders. So what you see in a lot of spiritual movement is you have these people who have come in at an early stage, been faithful to the movement, been willing to do whatever they were told to do, and now they've been put in a position of power, but they really are not very good leaders. So they often tend to abuse their power, and the spiritual movement gives them an excuse for abusing their power, because you can always say, if you're rebelling against me, you're rebelling against the guru or the ascended masters or God or whatever. So it gives these people a sense of power. And again, a sense that they are special. So I guess what we can say here is that there are many valid, constructive reasons for joining a spiritual movement. There are also some not so constructive. So I would say, I have been a member of several spiritual movements, and I benefited from it. Absolutely no question about it. Since 2002, I have been working with the Ascended Masters to bring forth spiritual teachings, but I have not started a spiritual movement that has a membership. I have some people I work with that organize conferences, but there is not an official spiritual movement. And the reason for that is partly that I haven't been asked to do it by the Ascended Masters, but also because I kind of feel it's not my role. And I see, based on my experiences with spiritual movements, that there's always a certain dynamic that comes in, because bottom line is this. If you put two people on a deserted island, like you see in the comic strips, a little piece of sand with a palm tree, their interaction is going to be determined by their psychology, their individual psychology, the psychology of the individual. And in any spiritual movement, it's the psychology of the individual. And I don't know, I just haven't felt that it was my role to start another movement, because there's so many movements out there. But this actually, now that I think about it, it actually leads me on to what I consider a major benefit of a spiritual movement. And it's one that most people don't think about. I didn't think about it for many years. But it is actually that here you have spiritual people, you put them together in a movement, and what will happen? Their psychologies will clash. And this can create a lot of conflicts that can be very unpleasant for people, but actually if you step back from it, it's an opportunity for growth, because it's an opportunity for people to see their psychology. And what often happens to people in spiritual movements is, of course, that their psychologies clash, there's power plays, there's people complaining about this person and other people, and the person is defending itself, and so it can be very traumatic for people, and it has torn a lot of spiritual movements apart. But it is actually an opportunity for people to come to a point where they say, wait a minute, why am I concerned about other people's psychology? Why am I not looking at my own? Why am I not looking at the splinter in the eyes of other people instead of looking at the beam in my own eye? And if you can make that switch, you can really grow. And then you have really grown from being in the spiritual movement. And that is a major point on the spiritual path. So if I was to say one benefit from spiritual movement, it would be this, that it causes people to have an opportunity to work out their psychology. I don't think most people would see it as a benefit, because they're still trapped in this trying to defend their psychology. And therefore, if you look at spiritual movements, many people have found it very, very traumatic to be part of a spiritual movement, precisely because of these power plays and personality conflicts. So I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm not trying to make fun of people, because I know that some people have found it very, very traumatic to be part of a spiritual movement. And But really, it is an opportunity to grow. And what I would say is that if you watch this long video to the end here, and if you've been in a spiritual movement and it was traumatic for you, you can really help yourself by making a switch of saying, why was I attracted to this movement? What was I meant to learn? What was I meant to see in my own psychology in the way I reacted? Because the way you reacted to a spiritual movement tells you something about the psychology you have, the subconscious selves I'm always talking about, that you haven't resolved. And if you can come to see it and resolve it, that will be a major step forward on your spiritual path. And it will really be, have made it worthwhile. Even if you left the spiritual movement 10 years ago, you can still look back and say, why did I react the way I did? And suddenly it'll be worthwhile to have been part of that spiritual movement. Now, in order to build on this idea that people have had negative or traumatic experiences with spiritual movements, there is actually a bigger perspective you can take on this. And that is that most spiritual people are open to the idea that we are moving from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And these are two different ages, two different cycles. They're different things we're meant to focus on. So I can see when I look back at my own past that I needed to be a part of certain spiritual movements in order to see what a spiritual movement was like in the age of Pisces and what it shouldn't be in the age of Aquarius. In other words, one point for being part of a spiritual movement is to learn something about how the spiritual movement should not be in the age of Aquarius. Because many spiritual movements are based on the Piscean mindset, the Piscean dynamic. Especially you see many Eastern movements that go back to whether it's the Indian Guru tradition or Buddhism, where they have this very centralized structure about one person who is the leader. You see that in some Western movements, of course, also. And I believe in the Aquarian age, the challenge is to create more of a movement that has more of a community spirit, where you don't have such a centralized leader that dictates everything, but where there are many people that are in a more or less equal way contributing to the movement, and it becomes more of a community decision, a community effort, rather than being directed from the top. That doesn't mean that it's everybody's opinions clashing about everybody, because if the people who are leading a community, if they have some attunement intuitively with the Ascended Masters, then they can receive directions from there, and that can then give a whole different dynamic in the group than if it's all centered around one person. And to be honest, that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't felt like starting a movement, because I see so many movements out there that are centered around one person. I see the limitations of it. And if there is a community that springs up, then I'm happy to support that in some way, but it can't be something that's started by one person, I don't think, in the Aquarian age. The challenge is, how will you then start it? And I don't have a ready-made solution for that.